So good day once again. This will be the chapter 3 of our capstone or research methods of research or thesis na 1. Okay, so covered structuring the research project. This will be the intended learning outcomes or objectives. Upon the completion of the chapter, the students demonstrate understanding of metaphysics and epistemology, inductive and deductive reasoning, hypothetico-deductive reasoning for scientific method, and positivism, relativism, postmodernism, and critical realism. Now, what is research projects or research project? Research projects are set up in order to explain a phenomenon or to test a theory. Research methods are the practical techniques used to carry out research. They are the tools of the trade that make it possible to collect information and to analyze it. What information you collect and how you analyze it depends on the nature of the research problem. The central generating point of the research project, hence the need for total clarity in defining the problem and limiting its scope in order to enable a practical research project with defined outcomes to be devised. And mostly, research methods course at undergraduate and more advanced levels culminate not in an exam but in a research project or dissertation where you can demonstrate how you have understood the process or research and how various research methods are applied. Hence, the need to be clear about the process as a whole so that the method can be seen without the context of a project. What is the research process? It is necessary to first define some kind of research problem in order to provide a reason for doing the research. The problem will generate the subject of the research. No? It aims and objectives and will indicate what sort of data need to be collected in order to investigate the issues raised and what kind of analysis is suitable to enable you to come to solution or conclusion that provides answers to the questions raised in the problem. This process is common to virtually all research projects, whatever their size and complexity, and they can be very different. These differences are due to their subject matter. So, for example, compare an investigation into subnuclear particles with a study of different teaching methods, differences in scale of time and resources, and extent of pioneering qualities in rigor. Some projects are aimed at testing and refining existing knowledge, others at creating new knowledge. Of course, the IT student, the ITE student or the ITE students, of course, are testing, using testing to validate and to find out the reliability of your study. Now, the answers to 4 important questions underpin the framework of any research project. What are you going to do? The subject of your research. We are asking about the subject of your research. What are you going to do it? The reasons for this research being necessary or interesting. Why? Why are you going to do it? So we are looking for the reason for this research. Then how are you going to do it? The research methods that you will use to carry out the project. Again, this question answered the research methods. And the last, when are you going to do it? The program of the work. The answer to these questions will provide a framework for the actual doing of the research. The answers to these questions are not simple, of course. And this discussion has been written or discussed to give you an indication of what is involved in answering these questions. Later on, I will show you a figure that shows the structure of typical research project and a rather linear sequence of tasks, which is far tedier what happens in reality. As knowledge and understanding increases during the course of the project, it is subject to constant reiteration. However, in a diagram, it is useful in order to explain the main order of the different stages in a research, and it can be used in order to plan out a program of work in the form of timetable or Gantt chart. No? We are using Gantt chart as an IT practitioner. And it can be used, this progress of the project can then be gauged by comparing the current stage of work with the steps in the process, what we call milestone, in our Gantt chart. Okay, so I have here our table. So review your subject areas to find problem areas. Investigate problem area to define a research problem. Study theoretical background. Of course, investigate relevant research methods. Write proposal to explain the research project and its timing. Examine ethical issues. It's also important, and gain approval to continue. Okay, as you can see here, you need to gain an approval to continue in your proposal. Okay? Carry out more background research to refine research problem. Okay? Write the background to research area. Explore methods for data collections and analysis. Check ethical issues. Describe why and how research method used. Why did you use, for example, a quasi-experimental? Why did you use, for example, a t-test? Okay, ANOVA, and so on and so forth. No? Carry out detailed research and data collection and analysis, report actions and results, and draw conclusion. And of course, disseminate results, indicate areas that need future research. So in IT, we are encouraged to include future work. Okay? Or sometimes we see this one to our recommendation. No. Now, the research problem. Sometimes it's too hard for us to develop a research problem. Actually, there is no shortage of problems throughout the world. Okay? But for a problem to be researchable, it needs to have several crucial features. Again, IT, to be researchable, it needs to have several crucial features. As I mentioned, okay? It must be stated clearly and concisely. We need to consider the significant, no? Not trivial or a repeat of previous work. Again, we are allowed actually to continue the previous study, provided that we can resolve the issues on their recommendations or even their future work. Delineated in order to limit its scope to practical investigation. Possible to obtain the information required to explore the problem, and possible to draw conclusions related to the problem, as the point of research is to find some answers. A research problem actually can be based on a question and unresolved controversy, a gap in knowledge, or an unrequited need within the chosen subject, an awareness of current issues in the subject, and an inquisitive and questioning mind, and an ability to express yourself clearly is required in order to find and formulate a problem that is suitable for a research problem. Initially, it is useful to define no more than a problem area within the general body of knowledge or subject, rather than a specific research problem. So example, school truancy, energy saving in buildings, home care for the elderly, okay, and so on and so forth. Then, by examining the different aspect of the problem area, and you can hone in on an aspect that is of particular interest to you, is controversial or is of particular significance. Then a rationale for the research problem can be defined. And this can be done, for example, by raising a question, by defining some research objectives, or formulating a hypothesis. Okay, so defining the research problem. Here are several forms in which the research problem can be expressed to indicate the method of investigation. So, we have question or questions. Probably, the simplest way to set up a research problem is to ask question, of course. This might be quite abstract in nature, so will require to be broken down into several sub-questions that can be practically investigated. The nice thing about question is that they demand answers, a good incentive to do some research. Question can be used to break the main problem down into questions to the defined sub-problems. The different things you can do to split up the main questions are to split it down into different aspects that can be investigated separately. They're political, economic, cultural, or technical. We can explore different personal or groups' perspectives. Example, employers or employee. Investigate different concept use, health, wealth, confidence, sustainability. Consider the question at different scales, the individual group, the group, the organization, and compare the outcomes of different aspects from the above ways of splitting down. In this case, the sub-question could concentrate on, So, what constitutes intelligence? Investigating a concept for intelligence, What ways of testing intelligence are there? Exploring different perspectives. So, other intelligent tests, and thus investigation the concept or test. What sort of school exams are there and how are they marked? So, investigating another concept out of exam. How do school exam criteria must match those of the criteria of other intelligence tests? So, split into aspect. In this case, criteria of exam and other intelligence test. Of course, we need to take note how all the sub-questions relate directly to the main questions and break down the rather abstract questions into practical questions that can be investigated individually and build up to answer to the main question. So for smaller scale studies, an exploratory approach may be used. The subject and scope of the exploration can be expressed in a statement of intent. Again, this must be derived from the research problem, imply a method of approach, and indicate the outcome. How about the hypothesis? The research problem in research projects that use the hypothetico-deductive method is expressed in terms of the testing of a particular hypothesis. Hypotheses are nothing unusual. So, we make them all the time. If something happens in our everyday life, we tend to suggest a reason for its occurrence by making rational guesses. Guesses. These reasonable guesses can be expressed in the form of statement. And this is hypothesis. If on further examination, a particular hypothesis is found to be supported, the reason for its occurrence seems to be correct, we have not a good chance that we can predict what will happen in the same situation in the future or can devise action to prevent it happening again. If the investigation shows that the guess was wrong, then it can be rejected as false. Many of the greatest discoveries in science were based on hypotheses. Actually, Newton's theory of gravity, Einstein's general theory of relativity, and a host of others. A good hypothesis is very useful aid to organize the research effort, but it must have certain qualities. Okay? It must be a statement that can be put to the test. It must specifically limit the inquiry of the interaction of certain factors, and usually called variables actually, and suggest the methods appropriate for collecting, analyzing, and interpreting the data, and the result, confirmation, or rejection of the hypothesis through empirical or experimental testing. Must give a clear indication of the extent of knowledge gained. Actually, the formulation of hypotheses is usually made on an abstract or conceptual level in order to enable the results of the research to be generalized beyond the specific conditions of the particular study. However, one of the fundamental criteria of a hypothesis that it is testable but formulated on a conceptual level cannot be directly tested. It is too abstract actually. It is therefore necessary to convert it to an operational level, and this is called operationalization. Often, the first step is to break down the main hypothesis into two or more sub-hypotheses. These represent components or aspects of the main hypothesis and together should add up to its totality. Each sub-hypothesis will intimate a different method of testing and therefore implies different research methods that might be appropriate. And this is similar process to breaking down main research questions into sub-questions. The operationalization of the sub-hypothesis follows four steps in the progression from the most abstract to the concrete expression by defining concept, indicators, variables, and values. How about prepositions? When you say prepositions, it is focusing on research study on a set of prepositions, or propositions, rather on a hypothesis. It allows the study to concentrate on particular relationship between events without having to comply with the rigorous characteristics required of hypothesis. The first proposition is a statement of a particular situation, which is then followed with further propositions that point out factors or events that are related to it and ending with one that indicates a conclusion that could be drawn from this interrelationship. The main research problem was formulated in the form of three interrelated propositions. Take note of it. Again, the main research problem was formulated in the form of three interrelated propositions. Number one, it is specifically designed, public sector housing provided for disabled person continues to be designed according to the government recommendation and standard for disabled people housing. Or the recommendation in standards are not based on an accurate perception of the needs of disabled person, or therefore there is a mismatch between the specifically designed public sector housing provided for disabled people and their accommodation requirements. In this example, it is clear that the research must investigate what the actual accommodation requirements of disabled people are and what the government perception of their needs is and how they compare it. The use of arguments. The whole point of doing a research project is to identify a particular question or problem, to collect information and to present some answers or solutions. In order to convince the reader that you have collected information relevant to the questions or problem and that you have based your answers and conclusions on the correct analysis of this information, you will need to use some logical argument. You might want to defend or challenge a particular point of view or propose a new or improved one. And you will have to play the part of a detective making a case in court. The detective will set out to solve the problem or who committed the crime and how by analyzing the situation or the scene and events of his or her conclusion about or the possible suspect, collecting and reviewing the evidence, then making a case of her conclusions about or who done it and how. The jury will have to decide whether the argument is convincing and that the evidence is sufficiently strong. In the case of a research project, you will be setting the problem and laying out your case, and the reader of your report, dissertation, or thesis will be your jury. As I mentioned earlier, there are two basic stages of an argument. The premises, which are statements in the form of propositions or assertions which form the basis of the argument. And the conclusion, which is proposition that expresses the inference drawn by logical steps from the original premises. Arguments are based on logical reasoning of which, as explained in the previous discussion. And these are two basic types as what we discussed last on our part 2, inductive reasoning, which entails moving from particular repeated observation to a general conclusion. And, of course, the deductive reasoning, which entails going from a general principle to a conclusion about a particular case. The hypothetico-deductive method or scientific method is a further development of logical reasoning based on the principle that we can never be completely sure of any premises or conclusion that we make, but we can be more confident about some than others. The more a premise or a conclusion has been tested and supported by repeated investigations, the more likely it is to be true. Also, conclusion can be refined if they are only seen to be true in particular situation. All scientific facts, such as the theory of gravity, are based on this approach. It is important to be aware of the type of reasoning that you will use to make your argument, or if you are reading through the research literature, what types of reasoning is used by each of the writers. Of course, it is not always easy to detect the simple steps of the argument as described, no? So it is worth knowing what to look out for when doing your background reading. There are also pitfalls that can occur to weaken or even invalidate the value of an argument. However persuasive it might seem as first reading. Recognizing and testing arguments, no? As well as constructing arguments to support your research conclusion, it is also necessary to recognize and scrutinize others people's argument, particularly those on whose work you are basing your research. In recognizing and testing arguments, no, or on recognizing arguments, in many types of writing, in other forms of disclosure, example conversation, TV programs, speeches, and others, the argument may be poorly expressed or submerged within the content. In order to recognize when an argument is being made, look for words that indicate a premise, such as since, because, if, assuming that, given that. Then look of words that indicate that a conclusion follows, such as therefore, disprove that, then, consequently, thus, no? And others. Then look for any logical reasoning and evidence that is given to link the two. The testing arguments, no? There are techniques that can be used to detect the valid from the fallacious arguments. Those whose logic follows the correct rules and those that do not. Fallacies fall into two main categories, formal and informal. The formal fallacies, no, are those where the logical structure underpinning the argument is faulty in some way. And there are many ways that logical structures can be faulty. Too many to be considered here, no? But for one example, consider the following simple argument. For example, no lawyers are criminal. John is not a lawyer, therefore John is a criminal. This makes a hidden assumption that all people who are not lawyers are criminals. And this is not one of the premises. If a first line was added, then when all non-lawyers are criminals, then the logic of the argument and its conclusion would be sound, despite the preposterous premises, no? Just like with computer programs, rubbish in, rubbish out. In formal fallacies, fallacies also come in many guises, no? These are misleading not so much because the logic steps are incorrect, but they make false analogies, use emotional and misleading claims, and jump to unjustified conclusion on evidence that is skimpy, irrelevant, or untrue. I will give you some example of a false analogies. Now, the ship of government, like any ship, work best when there is a strong captain in charge of it. That is why government by dictatorship is more effective. Is a ship really sufficiently like a government to make this claim? No. And that is an argument. Okay. Now, we have a constructing an argument. Although, Bonnet provides a choice of 6 types of argument. No? I reckon that there are only 2 basic aims of argumentation. One is to argue for a statement by providing evidence that will support it, and the other is to refute a statement by providing evidence that undermines it. Okay? Between these opposites can be a combination of the two, which entails a less black and white approach by arguing for a revision of refinement of the statement to get nearer to the truth. Again, based on the evidence presented. Another combination compares two statements, usually stating the opposite, and argues that one is right and the other is wrong. To argue in support of a concluding statement, you need to demonstrate that the premises are true. This may not be straightforward as truth is often difficult to pin down. Evidence in the form of data confirmation or agreement amongst experts will help to substantiate the strength of your claim. In research, evidence will often be new data generated by the project. So the reliability of sources and the methods of data collection must be clearly explained and justified. You then must employ a sound logical progression of steps to bring you to the conclusion. And the conclusion must be based exclusively on the premises. It is not possible to be absolutely certain that the conclusions are inevitable, and you have the option to soften the concluding statement with conditions such as it is likely that, it's probable that, and others. And to refute a concluding statement, it requires you to show that the conclusion is false or untrue. This can be done by challenging the logic of the argument, challenging the truth of evidence on which the argument is based, or questioning the relevance or completeness of the evidence. Another way to challenge an argument is to produce counterexamples that are deployed against either the premises or end conclusions. And this will undermine the universality of the argument, demonstrating that it does not hold in all cases. Alternatively, you might be able to demonstrate that the conclusion drawn will lead to absurdity if taken far enough. Constructing an argument and coming to conclusion about a research project is a cumulative process. No? It is unlikely that the chosen problem is simple, with questions raised that can be answered with a simple yes or no. Even if they can, you will be required to describe why it is one or the other and make an argument to support your case. Normally, the problem is divided down into smaller components requiring separate investigation. Conclusions about these components will occur in various sections of the analyzing part of the report of dissertation or thesis or capstone. Skill is then required to gather this up at the end in the concluding section to fit them together into a mosaic that will represent or present the complete picture of the conclusion of the main problem. And that's it for today. This will be my references, of course, and I hope to see you with my next video about Chapter 4, the research ethics. Thank you and good luck.